Hey everyone, welcome to week 3. This video is a quick review of week 2 to highlight a couple points to make sure we're clear on moving forward. First, before we get to that, a note about quizzes. You got a couple of those under your belt now, so I wanted to make a few general comments. Make sure your short answers, there's always going to be a couple of those, or usually will be a couple of those on your quizzes. Make sure they're not too short. I'm looking for some complexity. It's short answer, but it's not super short answer, okay? I'm looking for some complexity. There's always gonna be a number of things worth mentioning. There's gonna be more things you could mention than I'd expect you to put in a short answer. The most common reason for missing points, or even a half a point in the last quiz, was just leaving out an idea that was really important and emphasized repeatedly in the reading that didn't show up. So when you're doing the short answer, don't just think of one thing that you can put down. Think of as many things as you can and put down. And the more you get there, the better off you'll be. Don't worry about writing too much. If you put down a lot of things, you write down a really good answer that you're really proud of, you will get extra credit, okay? So I might say it's worth 3 points, but if you write a lot because you've got a lot to say, it was something you were interested in, you read about, or you went back and read carefully, you can get more, 3.5, 4 extra credit points. And those, it seems like nothing, but they add up. It's a long semester. But make sure you're embracing the complexity of the answer. I ask questions that are broad on purpose, expecting to get sort of broad, comprehensive answers, even though it's short answer, okay? True-false questions, obviously they test your general familiarity with the reading. Have you done it? Have you thought about it? Were you semi-conscious when you read it? They have to be kind of specific in order to be doable at all. But it's not really the specific detail that I'm interested in. These questions, even though they're true-false, they seem to be mostly straightforward, it's my effort to elevate some kind of signal above the noise of the reading, right? To highlight a couple ideas or themes that are going to continue to be important as we move through the class, right? So going back and looking at your quizzes, regardless of whatever you got on the score, just seeing what the question was gives you a reminder of things to be thinking about. I'm trying to get you to think about larger issues in the course. As you're doing the questions, I want you to ask yourself, what's the change that's being discussed here? How would you characterize this person or this movement or this phenomenon? What's it really about? Does this question really accurately describe it or characterize it? What's the similarities or differences that are at work here? Thinking in the big picture sometimes, which is what I'm trying to do when I'm writing the questions, that can sometimes make the question easier because you can understand kind of what the point I'm trying to get at by putting the question on the quiz. Again, it's not the particular factual detail that I'm interested in. It's the larger things that are happening in the course that I'm trying to get at through these very reductive questions. Okay, so remember the questions are there to help keep us kind of like following the same general narrative throughout the course, even though they obviously are meant to test your specific knowledge of the reading as well. So they have that dual function. Important to keep that in mind. Again, entirely optional. Jump onto the discussion board to debate quiz questions. We had a little action for the last couple of quizzes, so that was fun. I thought if you miss a point because the question wasn't good, as opposed to you didn't read it or you misread it, which happens. Everyone misreads things, misunderstands things. That's the point of the quiz, is to make sure we're not building on misunderstandings. But if the question is just misleading or it's very vague or it doesn't quite match what's in the reading, that's my fault. Okay, you shouldn't miss points for that. So make an argument. And people did make some successful arguments in the discussion board. So please consider jumping in there. You'll usually get extra credit for your effort. Not always, but usually. Okay, as far as ancient, medieval, and early modern history goes, most of you seem to get the main points, judging from the quiz and reflection scores. But apart from the score, even if you did really well, and especially if you didn't, it can be nice to hear sort of maybe what I was thinking about with the questions and what I was trying to do. So a few quiz questions I want to highlight because a lot of people got them wrong. One reason Herodotus and Thucydides remain fathers of history is because they so heavily influenced and standardized what citizens of the ancient world regarded as their history. This was false. 22% got it right. Are Herodotus and Thucydides fathers of history? Are they considered the fathers of history? Yes. Why? Because they standardized what citizens of the ancient world thought? No. And Popkin is very clear about that. There's a lot of historical traditions in antiquity. Herodotus and Thucydides sort of standardized in some ways what we consider to be sort of the origins of history. But it certainly didn't standardize what people at the time thought of as their histories, right? So the idea of them being the fathers of history is a label that modern people have applied to them. Maybe, and when I say modern, I mean early modern too. Renaissance scholars, rediscovering those texts, label those two individuals as sort of the originators of what they saw as the modern historical method. But it's not because they standardized knowledge. They didn't do that. Most people in the ancient world were totally unaware of those writings. They had their own histories. They had their own myths. They had their own sense of the past. But it wasn't through them. 2 more questions to cover. Augustine's writing emphasized that human actions are essentially unimportant in historical narratives because all events are fundamentally guided by divine power. 30% got this right. The answer is false. Augustine did not emphasize that human actions are unimportant. He was in fact very clear that they were significant. That's why biography is such an important historical genre. You learn about what a person did. We had this sort of debate a little bit in previous videos from the discussion board about how influential can a single person be. Human actions are important. They are less important than any kind of divine plan or providence. The city of God is always more important than the city of man, to reference his two cities that he writes about. But to say that human actions are essentially unimportant is not true. Last one. Most medieval histories were written by members of the clergy who wrote universal histories in the Christian tradition. False, I said. 25% of you got it right. Some of that, I think, was from dumb luck. Most medieval histories were written by members of the clergy. Absolutely true, indisputable. It's the second part that I was really trying to call your attention to. Were they all writing universal histories in the Christian tradition, or were most of them writing that? And Popkin tries to argue that members of the clergy increasingly were writing, obviously within a Christian tradition because they're members of the clergy, but they're also incorporating lots of different people and ethnicities and cultures and not civilizations, but sort of regional groups of people that weren't at all part of the universal histories. So the initial universal histories that were considered part of the Christian tradition began to really change. So they really weren't following that standard tradition anymore. They were trying to incorporate these new people and so on. The reason the question is really bad is because there was an effort on the part of the clergy to bring all these people into the Christian tradition. But in doing that, they were sort of creating a different kind of tradition. They were moving away from those universal histories to incorporate these different kinds of people. So that's what I was thinking. The question is really bad. Okay, I see that now. So I'm throwing it out. Everyone's going to get an extra point. Those of you who argued about it in the discussion board will get an extra credit point for making an argument because the question is too vague. Okay, I hope you see the point I was trying to make, but as far as true-false question goes, not particularly great. As for the reading response you did in terms of Renaissance humanism, I want to sketch out a few very brief answers to the discussion questions. How much did Renaissance humanism impact historical methods in writing? The main impact was source criticism. This was the one thing that humanists started to do that really hadn't been done before, that continues to be part of the historical tradition, and especially with this week 3, we start reading about the professionalization of history in the 19th century. And they too, those historians who are trying to create a discipline and a profession of being a historian are doing the same thing, source criticism. Why do you need source criticism? What does this mean? Lots of ancient and some medieval works. Think about the Roman classics. Think about the historians from ancient Rome that we read about, Cicero, Livy, Quintilian, and so on. They wrote, and especially the people who are writing, poetry and other sort of more cultural stuff. It's not necessarily history. These works were copied and recopied over for 1,000+ years, translated into Greek, sometimes into Hebrew, sometimes into Arabic, translated back. By the time Renaissance scholars are getting to what a text from, say, Livy, the history of Rome, it's been corrupted in all kinds of ways through all of these sort of scribal errors and translation errors and transcription errors. people who were copying the text were often unfamiliar with the actual text. They were just literally copying words that they didn't even necessarily understand. And so errors crept in. People substituted words accidentally. They skipped lines. They skipped pages. Scribes would see a manuscript. They'd be copying a manuscript and they'd see notes from someone else, the previous owner of the manuscript. And they would think that that was supposed to be a, sort of an edit to the text. And so they would take those person's comments and put it into the text as if it was part of the original. So by the time these Renaissance scholars are getting these texts, they've been horribly, horribly corrupted. And they sort of got a sense of that. And they realized that in order to know what these Roman and Greek writers, who they admired so much, what they really said, they had to go back to the sources, ad fontes. And that Latin phrase, ad fontes, is what really guided Renaissance humanists in their work to find sort of the real text, the actual text. Now, can you ever really get the original? I mean, can we totally prove that this is exactly what Cicero wrote, for instance? Not really. In some cases, maybe, but usually the originals were gone. But by looking at all of the different variants, by looking at all of the different traditions of how it has been copied and where and so on, it's a lot of work. You can sort of get as close as you can to the original. And this idea of being very critical of what your source is, how accurate it is, how do you collate different versions, this is what historians started to do later in the 19th century. Histories started to be written for specific political purposes in the Renaissance as well. So not only do you have this sort of critical attention to sources and citations, you start to have this very intimate tie between politics and history, which is not totally new. We've seen this in the medieval world, we've seen this in the ancient world, but you're starting to see it a lot more tied to specific claims about power. Machiavelli is the classic example mentioned in the book as well. Number two, how would you summarize what changes are happening in society in the writing of history in the Renaissance? Incorporating new people, right? Western Europe is discovering this huge new world and finding new people, new cultures, and they're trying to figure out, what do we do with these people? How do we fit them into our histories, right? Just like the medieval clergy trying to incorporate all these people that they didn't previously know about into their Christian histories. Renaissance historians, Renaissance writers of history were doing the same thing. Another major change, the spreading of ideas through the printing press and dissemination of historical claims. Historical dramas became very popular. It's not just about standardization and distribution. Obviously, those things are increasing too. But it's the same kind of, echo chamber effect that we see in social media all the time. The texts that are in front of people, the ones that are getting printed, the ones that are, it's not just that they are becoming sort of more popular, it's the other stuff is getting sort of filtered out. It's becoming not suppressed actively necessarily, but it's just not visible. And so when you see something in front of you often enough, it becomes reality. And so the texts, the histories that were being printed and distributed become kind of the dominant sense of the past. And this is a very powerful shift when histories used to be much more local and variegated and kind of organic in the sense that they would change over time. All of a sudden you have this set text now that's being distributed. People read that, they respond to it, it becomes part of historical discourse. And the other kinds of ways people talked about history and created history kind of go away. And so that's a very important change. And the printing press itself doesn't instantly change the world, right? It takes a while for people to sort of create that sort of culture of print and circulation and distribution and so on. But that is a major inflection point where the writing of history and how people understand it really are affected by the medium and distribution. You could say the same thing about social media in the last 30 years. Last question, how are Enlightenment historians doing things differently than before? How did the aims of historians and their histories change? Enlightenment historians began to conceptualize human experience as a story of progress. Western European man specifically, was at the top, and everyone else was trying to get there in their formulation. And so what they did in their histories is they tried to understand all of humans as kind of following the Western European model. And whatever the Western European had achieved and whatever they did was best, and everyone else is kind of working up to that. It seems really silly now. It made perfect sense at the time. And we kind of still do this in some ways that we'll get to later. But this idea of universal history is creating a story about everybody through the lens through the lens of Western Europeans and thinking about progress and thinking about sort of enlightenment. That guided their histories. And I want to highlight that here, and I put it in the reading reflection prompt, because that's one of the fundamental shifts we see in the 19th century with professionalization of history. Okay, another reminder, if you want more feedback, if you want more information about how you're doing in the class, if you want more information on a question or a topic, get in touch. Ask our TA, Chase. He's in the announcement board, his email. Very nice message there if you haven't seen it. Ask me, whatever. We're here to help, okay? Just let us know. Another thing you can do to improve your confidence about your own posting is look at other people's posts, okay? Are you writing more or less than anyone else? If you're writing more, that's probably good. You're hopefully getting extra credit for it. If you're writing less, that's a signal that maybe you're not quite keeping up. If you're making lots of generalizations without any examples from the reading, you're probably losing points. If you're not really answering the question, you're definitely losing points. And if you're writing in a sort of stream of conscious text message way where you don't have punctuation and it's just kind of like a stream of words and it's a lot of work to decipher what you might even be thinking about, you're definitely losing a lot of points for no reason. Okay, these are the most common reasons things get scored the way they do. These are all easily correctable, okay? Very easy to fix these. It just takes a little bit of time and a little bit more effort, but that really goes a long way throughout the course, right? It might make only a difference of a point or two per assignment, but when you do that times 2 times 16, that's a lot of points. That's a big grade difference at the end, right? So it adds up. So make sure you're taking care with these. They're short. They're meant to be confined. They're meant to be focused. They're meant to focus in on a couple issues, but they have to be done carefully, okay? And I want to make sure, hey, if you don't care and you want to get a D, that's fine. I'll let you do that. But I want to make sure you're doing it on purpose, okay? So if you want a good grade, take a little more care with these, okay? They're generally pretty good, but there's always room for improvement. That's it for the review for last time. Be sure to check out the week 3 overview video. It's mostly on chapter 4, it turns out. But that will help you with the reading reflection due Wednesday and put the whole week in context of the course. Talk to you later.